This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
Welcome back to our study of the Gospel of Matthew. In chapter 4, beginning with verse 18, it says, "And walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." This is the first occurrence of another one of our key words in Matthew, the word follow. It's not just Matthew's intention to prove that Jesus is the Messiah, but he also wants, by proving that Jesus is the Messiah, to show people what they need to do about that truth. And so he emphasizes the concept of following. If he's the Messiah, people need to follow. But how do they go about doing that? Well, this will be one of the great lessons that will be taught in the book of Matthew. 25 times in the Gospel of Matthew do we have the concept of following. We will see in several of the verses why following is such an important concept. In ancient times, when people found a teacher that they really respected, that really impressed them, they would leave their occupations and follow them. In the application to that for us today, we have to decide whether Jesus is the Messiah. Is he God's anointed? If we determine that he is, then we must then decide whether we want to pay the price that has to be paid in order to follow Jesus. Are you a disciple of Jesus? I hope so, because he is God's anointed. He is God's Savior. You know, there's so much about this that would be interesting to know that it was not a part of God's plan to record in his inspired word. But we suppose that this was not the first time that Peter and Andrew had ever encountered Jesus. Certainly there had been a lot that had led up to this: exposure to Jesus, listening to Jesus, seeing the things that Jesus was doing. And then finally, when Jesus is ready to start assembling his disciples, then he calls these two together to follow after him. What kind of concept would they have had in mind? Were they thinking that he was the strong-armed Messiah? Well, almost certain that Peter thought that, because when it came time for the struggle against the Roman soldiers, Peter was ready to draw the sword and struck off the Malchus's ear, and that's the kind of mentality that Peter had, and we certainly know that Simon the Zealot had the same mentality. Well, they were anticipating great things for themselves, and that was one of the reasons why they followed Jesus. And even in Matthew 19, when Peter asked the question, what is there in all this for us? Jesus did not chastise Peter for thinking about his own reward. As a matter of fact, Jesus goes on to explain that there is great reward for him for being a follower of the Messiah. Well, in Mark chapter 1, verses 16 through 20, we find a parallel account to the calling of the disciples. Now, there are two basic reasons why Christ chose the lowly and the unlearned, people like fishermen, to be his disciples. First of all, he chose them because their minds would be more free from prejudice and more ready to entertain new truth. These were not individuals that were in theological circles, and so they would have been less prejudicial and more ready to be taught. Secondly, the strength of the gospel is made more apparent by the weaknesses of its ministers. And in Acts chapter 4 and verse 13, it says that they saw that they were uneducated men. Well, that's certainly true. That's what they were. They were not educated men for the most part. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 3 through 5 says that I was with you in fear, with weakness and great trembling. And then we talk about the treasure in earthen vessels in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 7. So God chose to use men like this, fishermen, great men, a high character and quality, but yet they were not in the religious circles, nor were they in the educated circles that you might have expected that the Messiah would have drawn his followers from. Verse 20 says, "And they immediately left their nets and followed him." And going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father mending their nets, and he called them. And immediately, verse 20, they left their nets and they followed him. These were people that apparently were quite anxious to have the opportunity to follow the Messiah. The invitation's given and they follow. Why? Because they see the tremendous benefit in doing this. Now, certainly this adds credibility to the character of Jesus. Those that saw him, heard him, were the ones who believed in him and followed him. And the fact that they immediately followed shows that they were ready and willing to answer the call of Jesus. Verse 23 says, "And he was going about in all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom." Gospel is a word that means good news. He was proclaiming the good news about the kingdom and healing every kind of disease and every kind of sickness among the people. And the news about him went out into all Syria, and they brought to him all who were ill, taken with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, paralytics, and he healed them. When we look at this incredible description of the ministry of Jesus, what we're seeing is the power or the authority that Jesus possessed. Jesus did not miss anyone. Everyone with any kind of disease, no matter what their problem was, from demon possession to any sort of other physical ailment, Jesus was able to handle that. Now, the repetition that we have of these Jesus' power to healing is done for the sake of emphasis. Matthew does not want us to lose sight of the fact that Jesus had tremendous power that was displayed in these healings. How was he able to do this? How was he able to work miracles without one single failure? Well, the point is that Jesus was empowered by God. And being empowered by God, there were no failures. Now, there's a spiritual application to this that Matthew is going to draw out. And that is, there is no one that has anything that's wrong with them that Jesus cannot handle. Even those diseases the doctors would have thrown up their hands and given up on, saying, "I'm sorry, but there's nothing that the medical profession can do." Jesus had no trouble healing any of those, even the most difficult diseases. Even those that had a spirit which would have inhabited their body, such as demoniacs, Jesus could heal. Now, here's a lesson and application from this, and it can be drawn from a number of passages, but let's consider 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 6. There the inspired writer tells us, "For this is contained in Scripture. Behold, I lay in Zion a choice stone, a precious cornerstone, and he who believes in him," now notice this, "shall not be disappointed." You come to Jesus, you're not going to be disappointed that you made the decision to come to Jesus. Paul also makes this same point in a number of other passages, like Romans chapter 9, verses 32 and 33, and Romans 10 and verse 11. The point is this: you go ahead and do whatever it takes to get to Jesus. These people that were beset with these medical problems, you can imagine how difficult it was for them to go through all of the trouble that it would take to get to Jesus. You know, it's not enjoyable to travel when you're sick, when you don't feel good, especially when you have to walk or you have to ride on the back of an animal, maybe even do so in bad weather, maybe even travel for several days. Why did the people do this? Why did the people travel these great distances to make it to where Jesus was? Because they believed that they would not be disappointed. When Jesus offers the invitation in Matthew chapter 11, "Come unto me, all ye that are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." This is where all of the discussion about the healing really comes to a focal point, because everyone who is weary because of sin can come to Jesus and they will find rest. It doesn't make any difference what we have done in our lives, what sins you have committed or sins that I have committed. Jesus can forgive. Jesus has the power to provide that forgiveness. And so no matter what's wrong, Jesus can take care of our problem. Never once did Jesus say, sorry, I can't help you. Your problem is something that I can't deal with. Never once did Jesus have a failure. Every single time he had success, 100% success rate. So if I come to Jesus, I'll not be disappointed. If you come to Jesus, you also will not be disappointed. Verse 25 says, and great multitudes followed him from Galilee and Decapolis and Jerusalem and Judea and from beyond the Jordan. People from the other side, the east side of the Jordan, were coming over to follow Jesus. So the word about him was spreading everywhere. Now, we're about to begin the first of the 5 speech sections. The first begins there in chapter 5 with the Sermon on the Mount. But there's something that goes with the speech sections that's very significant, and that's the concept of healing, what we're going to call healing sections. Now, there are a number of healing sections in the Gospel of Matthew, and here they are. Chapter 4, verses 23 and 24 will say that he healed them all, and that's what we're calling a healing section, where it emphasizes that Jesus healed them all. In 8:16 and in 9:35, healing every kind of disease and sickness. Chapter 12, verse 15, twice in chapter 14, chapter 15, and then the final one in chapter 19 and verse 2, giving us a total of 8 healing sections. Now, intermixed with these healing sections are going to be 5 speech sections. And what are the 2 concepts that are going to be found in the healing sections, in the speech sections that are going to be emphasized? Do you remember? It's going to be the concept of the kingdom and the Father. So on the basis of Jesus' healing, then he is able to turn right around and teach them about the Father and about the kingdom. Now there's going to be a pattern or maybe a cycle that we're going to see in the Gospel of Matthew, and it's going to go like this. You'll have miracles like we have here in chapter 4. And then you'll have people that are following, which is what it says in chapter 4 and verse 25. Then you'll have teaching, which is what we'll find in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. And then you'll go back and there'll be more that have to do with following. In chapter 8 and verse 1, after the teaching section, it'll say that great multitudes followed him. And then that will bring us to more miracles, which will lead us to more following, which will bring us yet to another teaching section. And so this is the cycle or the pattern that we're going to find in the Gospel of Matthew. All right. Now, as we move on and we go into chapter 5, it says, and when he saw the multitudes, he went up to the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. All right, this is pursuing what happened in the last verse of chapter 4, now leading us into chapter 5, and that's the concept of following. We have people today that follow Jesus from place to place, but they're not true disciples. They go to church, but they live their lives in such a way as to show that they are not true disciples. During the week, they do not live the way a disciple should live. And so Jesus performed all these miracles. He's got all of these people that are following, and now he brings them to the mountain, and he is going to teach them. And opening his mouth, he began to teach, saying, blessed are the poor in spirit. These are often called the Beatitudes. The word beatitude comes from a Latin word beatudo, which means perfect happiness. Well, perfect happiness is an indication of what Jesus is promising, eternal happiness more than happiness in this life. But let's talk about this word blessed. This comes from the Greek word makarios, and the word means approved of by God. This is not a word that means happy, not in the sense that we normally think of happiness, but this has to do with someone who has lived their life in such a way that God is pleased with them. Like Psalm 1, blessed is he because he delights in the law of the Lord. Or in Deuteronomy chapter 33 and verse 29, Israel is blessed because there are people saved by the Lord, and God's with them. Psalm 32 and verse 1, a person is blessed who has been forgiven. He's approved of God, the forgiven person is. James chapter 1 and verse 2, the one who has endured under trial is blessed. He's approved of God. All right, so let's proceed then into the Beatitude. First of all, he says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Well, when we think about this first Beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. There are a number of surprises that would have been found as Jesus introduces this great speech, perhaps one of the first speeches that he gave. All right, let's consider some of the surprises that would have been found in this particular speech. First of all, there would have been a surprise that Jesus would redefine and publicly contradict the accepted teachings of the scribes and Pharisees. Jesus had the nerve to suggest that those less than perfect could be blessed, that is, they could be approved of God. Well, he taught that these lower class individuals could actually be the recipients of God's love, God's blessings, and even be a part of His much desired kingdom. Here is someone who is poor in spirit, but they have the possibility of being rich in the kingdom of God. All right, a second surprise that would have been found in this terminology is that Jesus would tie together the words blessed and poor. The Jewish teachers had long stressed the connection between material prosperity and God's favor. Jesus even taught in Luke chapter 6 and verse 24, woe to the rich. Well, he had to have stunned his disciples in teaching on the subject, because when Jesus said how hard it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, the disciples, totally stunned, said, and who then can be saved? One of the most popular concepts was that all those that were in the Messianic kingdom would be those that had untold wealth. But Jesus would boldly teach, you cannot serve God and money. So to suggest that someone who was poor, even if it's poor in spirit, could be blessed of God or approved by God was a concept that would be very difficult for the Jews to understand, because they associated wealth with being blessed of God. All right, now let's consider some of the predominant teachings that Jesus is making by this first beatitude. First of all, he is suggesting that the poor could easily be blessed by God. Remember that the word blessed means approved of God. The word for poor here also is not the usual word for poverty, but this is a word that means an individual who has no power or no influence on earth, and he is totally dependent upon others for support. Also, this person, because he has nothing on earth, has learned to completely trust in God, and he's not relying upon all of his material blessings. A second teaching that we have from Jesus here is that it is the poor in spirit that are blessed. The person who receives God's approval is the one who recognizes his spiritual poverty. Jesus isn't saying you're blessed because you're physically or materially poor, but it's the poor in spirit that are blessed. These are people that know their spiritual need, and that's in contrast with the proud, the haughty, the self-sufficient, like the Pharisees, who are conscious of no needs of their own. This person also has no connection with the poor-spirited person that's totally without self-esteem, dejected, self-pity. And Jesus isn't talking about those people that go around and woe is me and poor little old me, I don't have anything. That's not what he's talking about. We learn that it's neither physical poverty that is blessed or physical wealth that is cursed. For example, Joseph of Arimathea and Zacchaeus were both very wealthy men, but they were also approved of God. Those who are humble in spirit are those who do not think too highly of themselves, and that's who he is talking about. Now he says that those who are poor in spirit are going to receive the coveted kingdom of heaven, and that's the third teaching that he gives here. They're going to be the ones to get this kingdom of heaven, to receive this kingdom. We learn that the kingdom can belong to anyone who wants it. Those who recognize their spiritual poverty will gladly receive Jesus as their Lord and their King. Therefore, proud, self-righteous people they're not going to be fit for the kingdom. Who was it, though, as we look in the Bible, that accepted the gospel? Was it not the poor? Was it not the unlearned? Those people who were humble folk, those were the people that accepted the gospel. And again, we remind you that there's special significance to the phrase kingdom of heaven. The Jews were looking for a physical kingdom to be set up, but the true kingdom, according to John 18, verse 36, is not on the earth. And so, blessed are the poor in spirit. These are people that recognize their poverty, they recognize the need for God. Those are the people that are going to be open to be taught by God. All right, let's go on to the second beatitude. And this in verse 4, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. These are individuals that, as they're listening to this, there are going to be a number of surprises, a number of things that are going to equally catch them off guard when he says this. The first of which is that anyone who mourns could be blessed. They thought that mourning was something that was caused by God. And so when Jesus talks about a person mourning who's being blessed, that would not seem to fit their thinking. But in Isaiah chapter 53, verses 4 and 8, we see that a person could in fact be blessed by God and be mourning. They thought that suffering was caused by sin. For example, the blind man in John 9, they said, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? The idea of a person mourning or groaning or suffering for no reason at all was not acceptable in their way of looking at things. So here is a person that's approved of God who is mourning. That would be a real surprise to them. Mourners were not to be comforted in the way that they generally understand it. They were to be encouraged to repent, let God remove the source of the discomfort. Now, there would also be another surprise, and that is that there could be a blessing or a comfort offered to one who chooses to mourn. Why would a person choose to mourn? If happiness is tied in with material prosperity and you have nothing but joy and laughter, that's supposed to be indicative of a good relationship with God. Jesus says, no, not so. Blessed are those who mourn. This is a choice. A person is choosing to mourn. All right, let's look then at some of the teachings that Jesus is offering here. First of all, he is teaching the blessing that awaits those who mourn is to receive God's approval. Jesus tells us that we need to acquire this attitude. We need to be mourners. Happiness, as the world understands it, is conditioned by circumstances, by external things. But blessedness is God conditioned. If we're going to be God approved, then we need to be happy because of what's inside of us and our relationship with God, not because of what is happening around us. Now, Jesus uses a specific word for mourn here. Pentheo is the word. And that is a word that indicates a deep, sincere, heartfelt grief. It's a mourning that cannot be hidden. Now, the word here is in the present tense. And so he's talking about mourning, continuing to mourn. The word for mourn is found in the New Testament describing a Christian that is mourning for his sin. For example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, and 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 21. this is a sorrow that's not hidden. This is a person that is mourning because of the existence of sin, and it emerges in the tears and the confession of the truly penitent heart. Is it possible to have great thoughts about God, to maintain a great relationship with God, and to have little thought for sin? Well, Jeremiah asked the question, no one says anymore, "What have I done?" That's the problem with the people in Jeremiah's time. We need to be concerned about sin. And then another teaching that we have from Jesus is that those who mourn will be comforted. Now, if the mourning that they're having is because of sin, how then will they be comforted? Herein lies one of the great lessons of Jesus. Jesus himself is how we're going to receive comfort. He is the one. If you're mourning because of your sin, then you're going to receive comfort, because Jesus is going to come and provide the comfort that you need by forgiveness. If you're mourning because of sin, how are you going to overcome the mourning? By being forgiven. What comfort then does Jesus provide us? All right, he provides us the forgiveness. He provides us a peace, Luke 7 and verse 50 and John 16:33. And he provides us an exaltation, James chapter 4 verses 6 through 10. The Christian is not one that goes through life with a long face and a sour disposition. He needs a psychiatrist if that's his problem. Continually mourning is not healthy. The way Jesus is trying to comfort us is that once we're forgiven, then we receive the comfort that we want and the comfort that he is providing. And that's one of the beautiful things that Jesus is promising. Blessed are the merciful, for they, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. All right, let's go on to the next beatitude in verse 5. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. The word gentle is a word which means to be humble or to be meek. It does not have the implications of weakness in any way at all. In Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3, it talks about how Moses was the meekest man in all the earth. Now, meekness or humility is a word that means this: subject to the will of another. When it says that Moses was the humblest man in all the earth, it means that there was no one that was more intent on subjecting himself to God's will than was Moses. All right, so blessed are the meek, or the humble, for they shall inherit the earth. When you're constantly yielding to the will of God, then you can in fact have tremendous blessings and inherit great things. One of the early writings in the Greek language uses this word as a bridle horse. It's strength under control. Meekness is not weakness. It's strength under control. And so we're using the strength that God has given us, and we're willingly giving that strength, yielding that strength to God. That's meekness. Now, when it says that they shall inherit the earth, those of the premillennial persuasion will say that this is literal, and it's talking about the inhabited earth after judgment, that if you're meek, you're going to inherit this earth, and this will be your eternal home. But it's more likely that Jesus has one of these two concepts in mind. First of all, he could be referring to the new heavens and new earth, as mentioned in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 13 and Revelation chapter 21 and verse 1. 2 Peter 3 says, according to his promise, we look for new heavens and new earth in which righteousness dwells. So if we subject ourselves to the will of God, that's what a righteous person would do, then we will in fact be a part of the new heavens and new earth. And it's possible that Jesus has this in mind. Or it is also possible that Jesus is referring back to the promises made in the old law. In Deuteronomy chapter 28 verses 1 through 25, you have the land promise given to God's people that as long as they do God's will, they will have the blessing of the land. And the application that Jesus would be making would be this: you submit to his will, then you will receive the blessings. And so it would be a reference back to the law of Moses, saying, if you're meek, if you're going to subject yourself to the will of God, then you're going to inherit the promises that God said that you would in fact inherit. Verse 6, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. A person who does not get thirsty or hungry is either sick or dead. So a person who does not hunger and thirst for righteousness is spiritually sick, or they are spiritually dead. Righteousness, you're hungry and thirsting for righteousness, that means doing God's will. What God has declared is right. And that's what he's talking about in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. Jesus is going to bring us to that point. He says, you hunger and thirst for righteousness shall be satisfied. Whereas physical meals satisfy for a time, there comes a time when we need to eat more food. Well, also the manna from heaven in the Old Testament was to be gathered every single day. So our spiritual appetites need a continual feeding. And God promises that it's there and it's readily available for us. We will have what it takes to meet those needs. If you're hungering and thirsting for righteousness, that's a continual hungering and thirsting. But equally, God continues to supply the spiritual food that we need in order to be satisfied. All right, the third, or the next beatitude that we have is found in verse 7. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. A merciful person is one who gives or does something for another at no cost to the one who received it. All right, that's what mercy means. Blessed are those who give or they do something for someone else, and they're not expecting anything in return. They're not expecting anything back. All right, mercy is not just tied into the willingness to be forgiving. Mercy has the idea of your being willing to give of yourself, whether it's material possessions or it is to be willing to forgive someone else. He says, for they shall receive mercy. If you are the one who is very liberal with things that you give to others, you're constantly giving to others without any anticipation of receiving something back for them, God is going to give back. If you're the kind of person that when people offend you or when people sin against you, you're showing mercy and kindness and forgiveness, then that's the kind of mercy that you can expect to receive from God. All right, verse 8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Pure means to be clean or holy. And the heart, when the Bible uses the word heart, it's often talking about the mind or the thinking apparatus. It is the duty of man to do the will of God, and it's got to go deeper than just actions. It has to be in the heart. That means your purity is sincere and genuine. It's not just an outside show of purity. It's really a purity that's in the heart. Jesus called the Pharisees whitewashed walls. Boy, they look great on the outside, but there's no inward purity. He says, those who are pure in heart shall see God. This goes along with a number of passages such as Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 14, the sanctification without which no one will see the Lord. And 1 John chapter 3 and verse 2, being able to see God is based upon purity. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 14 talks about that you shall be holy as I am holy. God has called us to be holy. He's called us as we stand in His presence to be holy people. Consider an Old Testament passage in this regard. Isaiah chapter 59 verses 1 and 2. Behold, the Lord's hand is not so short that it cannot save, neither His ear so dull that it cannot hear. But your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God, and your sins have hidden His face from you, so that He does not hear. All right, you're not going to be able to see God then because of sin. That's what Isaiah 59 verses 1 and 2 teach. But Jesus comes and He teaches, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Well, when you receive the forgiveness that Jesus provides, then you're pure. And when you're pure, you will see God. What a beautiful teaching that we have here. Verse 9 says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." Being a peacemaker talks about conflict resolution, solving problems and strife that are between people. At this time, the Jews were very angry people. They were getting ready for wars. Assassinations were being carried out by the zealots. There was a want for bloodshed, and the Jewish society is breaking into sects, and the society is splintering. There's not much peace in this day and age. That's something that requires effort, and you cannot be a peacemaker without working very hard at being a peacemaker. He says if you are a peacemaker, you're going to be called something. You're going to be called a son of God. In the Bible, when it talks about a son of something, it means that you have the characteristics of whatever you're a son of. And God is a God of peace, according to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 23. And according to Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 19, God is one who hates those who destroy peace. And notice passages like Isaiah 48 and verse 22. It says, "There is no peace for the wicked," in Isaiah 57 verse 21. And Jesus in Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6 is called the Prince of Peace. And he teaches the disciples in John 14 and verse 27, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives do I give to you." So he is, in fact, the Prince of Peace. You need to be a peacemaker. It might also be included in this idea that Jesus is talking about, that you need to work to try to establish peace between people and their God. As James chapter 4 talks about that sin causes strife and enmity between you and God. You can't be friends with the world and be a friend of God. And so the peace is destroyed when, in fact, a person does not live righteously. But if you're a peacemaker, then you're one that's bringing people to God. All right, that's a good place to stop, and we'll pick up with the next beatitude found in chapter 5 and verse 10 in our next class.